Lots of good conversation always since yesterday and also this morning. This morning was all about step zero for getting the conservation right. Erica told us great story about her fishing with her father and how that historical knowledge, traditional knowledge, local knowledge are being really we need to pay attention to. And then we have a lot of colleagues as well, from the scientist perspective, we're trying to understand the ecosystems, we're trying to integrate the human and the importance of culture and tradition in the way we think about this. And I'm sure our governments and organizations that are trying to get things right, are doing their best to incorporate those knowledge, different types of knowledge, and trying to do this consultation. But of course, there's so many different ways to participate and engage, and we still need to work a little harder to think about what we need to do to really make it work in terms of providing space for people to give input and then organize our institutions, including in our legislation, to make it possible for those inputs to be properly incorporated and then go eventually into some action. So I think that's what people are really interested in hearing more, knowing more. So what we have invited for this session, and I'm going to turn it over very soon to the session chairs, is to really talk about some of the experiences that our speakers have in the past, and also what they see today in terms of what we need to do to get governance right. And I would invite our audience and participants. I mean, you've been great at providing inputs, but let's work together. This is not about who does, whether you do it and other people should do the same. This is like really, let's have a good interactive dialogue so that we are doing this together. I'll turn this over to Suzanne and for your introducing of the session and also the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Susan Squires, and I'm going to be introducing the panelists, but let me give you a little background first on what we're going to be doing. We're going to try to start the conversation or further the conversation on governance. We've already started talking about stakeholders in the last plenary, and now we're going to continue that conversation with some speakers in the first part of this. And then in the second part, it's going to be your turn. We want you to hear your voices. I've been impressed with the level of knowledge that has attended this conference, both on Zoom and here in the sessions, in the papers. And so we want to bring everyone together to have the voices and also some insights from everyone that's here. So in the second part of this, we'll have you organized into small groups so that you can start thinking about these, talking about these things individual in the small group session, and then report back so that we can have all your voices heard. I am introducing the speakers, but I am just one of 3 chairs of this plenary. So Pritep Nayak is another, and Kristen Lobit is it was at the 3rd and will be monitoring the Zoom part. So welcome everyone that's in Zoom. Okay, so we're going to start the conversation, or add to that conversation with 3 speakers who have a deep knowledge of the North American fisheries, because they've been involved collectively. Shall I say it? They probably have 100 years of experience. Together. Individually, it's only about 10. The first speaker, I don't think, for many of you, she needs no introduction. She's been instrumental in the Newfoundland fisheries research since the 1990s. She recently retired as the John Lewis Pinton Distinguished University Professor and Honorary Research Professor in the university where she was based in the Department of Sociology. As I said, she needs no introduction. I know some of the folks here are her students and others are her collaborators and former students. And so with that said, and you knowing all about her already, I introduce Barb Nice.
How do I find my presentation? Somebody finds it. Good. Well, it's great to be here. I hope there's a few people who don't know what I'm going to say. There is some diversity here. So thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in the conference and in this plenary. We've been jokingly talking about this as the Raging Grannies session, because we're all grannies. We've all been around for a while. So let's just, I changed the title about 6 times. So just wait till it's up. Okay, is it up? And do I know how to change slides? It's not changing. It is changing. Okay. All right. So first of all, I want to make some acknowledgements. The first acknowledgement is that I acknowledge that the lands on which we're situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups and acknowledge with respect their diverse cultures and histories. And I really like putting that acknowledgement before the funding agencies, who are the Ocean Frontier Institute, the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, and NSERC and SHRC over many decades. Okay, so after that acknowledgement, I also want to say a few things before we go on. First, let me say that I'm not a governance theorist in a formal sense, and I'm well aware that there are huge bodies of work, much of it done by those here and others working with them that I've not read or dissected. So I approach this task with humility. As a retired critical social interdisciplinary researcher, please be aware that I've done more research on sources of vulnerability, i.e. governance failures in fisheries, than on governance strengths and successes. Furthermore, while pessimism and despair are luxuries none of us can afford, I'm well aware of the gap between good theory, supported by good research and good intentions, and the capacity to achieve meaningful and enduring social change. Developing indicators for good governance is a critical, but only a small step in the journey to achieving vibrant, diverse, and adaptive, ecologically, socially, economically, and culturally sustainable small-scale fisheries. Getting governance right requires all hands on deck, as well as commitment, engagement, collaboration, transparency, and accountability to the present and to future generations of humans and other than humans. It requires hard work, the space to make mistakes, to learn from those mistakes, close and careful listening, and trust. All of these are perhaps particularly essential and fragile in times like these, when the devastating but unevenly distributed effects of climate change are increasingly obvious and only getting worse. When the pandemic has eroded our comfort with social engagement, outreach, and collaboration locally and globally, and when democratically elected governments and the complex network of civil society organizations necessary to make democratic governance work are so threatened by the allure of authoritarian top-down solutions offered up by increasingly powerful and wealthy elites. And now in parts of the North, as has been the case for a long time, in many parts of the South and for Indigenous groups, by the threats of vigilante violence, war, displacement, imprisonment, injury, and death. Getting governance right is not an objective for the faint of heart. That said, I'm continuously impressed by the ongoing work being done by so many, including individuals and families, Indigenous and settler civil society organizations, unions and conservation groups, researchers and public servants, in an effort to make visible, preserve, protect, and often transform as appropriate the laws, policies, institutions, practices, and relationships we have with each other and with the environment in pursuit of fairness, equity, and justice. This is hard work, under-resourced, and under-rewarded. So congratulations to all of you for being here and for working on this big project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, because it is the 30th anniversary of the Northern Cod moratorium, and in fact of many Atlantic groundfish moratoria, with governance failure. And given that most of my work has happened in Newfoundland and Labrador, and it started well before the moratorium, but it went through it and that's continued to mark that work, it makes sense. I'm then going to shift to a brief discussion. So that briefly, I take great liberties in summarizing what happened in 2 slides. I'll then talk about the governance issues in the post-collapse era. How about why, and in what ways rebuilding collapsed fisheries is a particularly wicked governance problem. For those of you who are not there, don't go there. Do everything you can to avoid it. And provide a few reflections on where we find ourselves now and what that might tell us about getting governance right. I may not get through it all, and probably won't. So I have a few takeaway questions for the group discussions afterwards, and if I need to, I'll just jump to those at the end. Okay, so starting with getting governance wrong, or failed or compromised governance. As most of you will know, multiple groundfish fishery moratoria were imposed by the federal government on Atlantic fisheries in the 1990s. Not just the Northern Cod, many cod stocks and other groundfish stocks, many of which are still closed. These moratoria happened 15 or more years after what the late, sorry, I don't know why I did that, Jeff Hutchings talked about the called the killer spike in 1968. So 1968, you get this massive killer spike, the cause of which is devastating effects from distant water fleets that converged on the North Atlantic and on the coastal zone areas, and absolutely devastated those stocks in a completely unregulated race for the fish. And these are, what we have are the landings data. What we don't have is the real catch data. And we know that now because we've watched what happens when stocks collapse, right? The fish get smaller, they take more, they line the nets, there's more discarding and so on. All we ever see are the things, the statistics for what's landed, and those in themselves are actually overwhelming. So it was that and many other things, including very serious observation and concerns from small-scale fisheries and pushing from the grassroots, that eventually led to the establishment of the 200-mile exclusive economic zone. And the thing about this map is it shows you that, and what it shows you is the massive scale. But what are we taking on here? We're taking on territory, unknown territory that vastly exceeds or approximates the size of the land base that we've been operating on, that we know fairly well and that we actually don't govern particularly well. So that was huge. And with it came the responsibility for implementing a stock assessment and management regime for multiple fisheries in exchange for Canadians having primary access to the fish. The governance challenge during this period was enormous. Given that its foundation was stock assessment science that was in its infancy, no one really knew what was in the water. They didn't know about stock structure. They didn't know about natural mortality. They didn't know about fishing behavior. And, and that was for the best understood species. There are many species about which nothing was known. The story is complex, but let's just say key factors in the Northern Cod and other collapses were, as argued by Finlayson, failed governance versus individual villains per se. A combination of techno-utopian faith in imperfect science and management tools, enhanced by the rapid expansion of Atlantic Canadian fishing capacity to access the anticipated volumes of fish projected to appear and limit the need to share resources with international fleets and many other factors, including closed-door science consultations and management decision-making, with reliance on offshore catch rates and stock assessments, lack of consultation, and engagement with small-scale fisheries. The result was essentially stock collapse, multiple stock collapse. That's all too vividly, for me, captured in this little snapshot of the last fishery off the coast of Black Tickle in Labrador, a Métis territory, an essential base for those communities, where essentially harvesters from 4 zones were allowed to converge on the remaining aggregation and fish it out. And so in 1989, they took 35 million pounds. And in 1991, there were 6 codfish yielding 2 pounds, and they were taken at Black Tickle. And the recovery there has been slower, for not just for cod, but for capelin and for many other things than has been the case in other areas. It's hard to know what might have prevented the groundfish collapse, given the institutional and scientific basis for governance that existed at the time. But this and other collapses fueled massive amounts of research into both why stocks collapse and ultimately into how to redesign fisheries governance in order to begin to recoup the massive loss, the costs in common good, more generally, including to the affected fishing and processing families and the wider communities. Work I was involved with used research on fish harvesters' knowledge and science using interdisciplinary teams, essentially through a non-governmental academic science and industry research collaboration in the 1990s. Our focus was the northern cod region, but we looked at multiple species. The dynamics we documented from our research with fishermen were not evident or easily available to fisheries science and management with the data they had before them at the time, and would not have been easy to integrate into either stock assessment or management at that time, not simply because of the models, but also because of institutional silos and other challenges. They were the beginning for me in thinking about fisheries as dynamic and complex, interactive social ecological systems, the governance of which some have defined as a wicked problem. So what is a wicked problem? Problems that are complex. They're characterized by deeper problems that go beyond natural sciences to encompass social, economic, and political considerations. They can be hard to perceive. They don't present a clear set of alternative solutions. They're associated with contradictory or irreconcilable certitudes and tend to have distributional and procedural equity implications for stakeholder groups. The cod collapse is a perfect example of a wicked problem. How do you fix this? And they're also generally not solved for once. And I think it's really interesting what we've been hearing at this conference about the things that were done to try and solve this and where we are now and where we're going and so on and so forth. Post-collapse governance. So we've looked at post-collapse governance. The formal policy responses to stock collapses, not just in Newfoundland and Labrador, but globally, have tended to focus on stock rebuilding by reducing fish mortality, implementing a precautionary approach, and refining or developing stock assessment models with investment in stewardship and some support for fisheries co-management and science industry research collaborations like we saw yesterday that were presented by Erin Carruthers. On the management industry side, the focus has been on restoring and improving profitability by downsizing and privatizing and limiting access to quotas and licenses in terms of both fishing and processing, with some successful pushback around redistribution of access to expanding quotas for shellfish to small-scale fishers and around expanding Indigenous fishers. Oops, sorry, I should go back. The outcomes: ongoing gaps in scientific knowledge, limited stock rebuilding, ongoing reliance on limited species and products, substantial reductions in fisheries employment, particularly in some regions, the marginalization of fisheries decision-making from community concerns. So we heard about how important fisheries are to communities yesterday, but communities are not at the table when there are discussions that are happening around fisheries and how they should be governed. aging labor forces and labor shortages, the irony, right? This is the region known for high rural unemployment and poverty. And now somehow we've ended up in a place where we have labor shortages that were anticipated by some of us, and a reliance on temporary foreign workers, at least at the moment, in growing in the processing sector. We have more wealth from fisheries, but issues with distribution and access to that wealth. We have persistent gender, intergenerational, and regional, I think of Labrador, inequities, and the concentration of control over processing, which all of which working together continue to place small-scale fisheries in jeopardy. So getting governance right. In 2014, a group of us, including community stakeholders and researchers, developed a policy paper. And we called it Moving Forward, Building Economically, Socially, and Ecologically Resilient Fisheries in Coastal Communities. We provided an overview of the strengths and vulnerabilities of the fisheries at the time, and it was based on extensive research. And we provided a series of more than 40 recommendations for ways to achieve what we're now calling full spectrum sustainability in fisheries. You know, and I look at that and I think that it was one, prescient, and two, I'm saddened by, in fact, how little has happened as a result of that. It wasn't perfect. There were many gaps, but it was a point of departure. It was our, in a sense, a fisheries accord. Newfoundland Labrador has a health accord now. We invested millions to produce. It was our attempt at the beginning of a fisheries accord. So, so we now have the United Nations Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. There's been significant progress on multiple fronts, including identifying all the commitments Canada has made. Thank you, Rob Stevenson, that if followed, could help move fisheries forward based on a full spectrum sustainability model. The issue is not, in my view, identifying strategies or means to get governance right for small-scale fisheries anymore, but these are wicked problems, so the work is ongoing. The issue is how to get from here to the governance institutions and the personnel and the practices needed to actually accomplish governance informed by these insights. So these are my takeaway questions. Whose job is it to get governance right? Whose job is it to critically assess good governance claims? Everybody will claim they got it right, and actually hold those making those claims accountable. I hear too many fictions floating around and unchallenged. Can we get governance right without ongoing, grounded, collaborative engagement guided by careful and reflexive, our own reflexive in that too, attention to and strategies for engaging with power dynamics from local to global scales? And I reference a paper that Courtney Parley presented yesterday. You know, I think it's a really important paper because they try to take the issue of power on, and the issue of power is not going to go away. Is good governance like domestic labor? Is it feminized, largely invisible, undervalued, under-resourced, and thus vulnerable to failure and critique? I see that again too much. Good governance really takes a lot of work nobody's going to pay you to do. Right? It requires a kind of engagement and commitment that doesn't fit necessarily very well with rapid career mobility, climbing the ladder, meeting your own needs. And it doesn't actually fit all that well with having a family, with, you know, I mean, we heard yesterday in the session on basic income from the mayor of Port-au-Port, who's also the wife of a fish harvester, who described the struggle that she and her partner were having in order to basically try to become fish harvesters, to break into that fishery and have a family and do all of the things. You know, and I thought, have we done a gender analysis of our fisheries licensing policies in terms of an analysis that would help us understand why there are so few women who are skippers, why they're locked for the most part into apprenticeships, you know, and why we still have in Newfoundland and Labrador, we just documented it, the biggest wage gap in Atlantic Canada between women fish processing workers and male fish processing workers. And then we wonder why women don't want to work in fish plants. Can they afford to work in fish plants? So I could go on. I'm going to stop. I'm sure Susan's been extremely patient, and I'm looking forward to the next presentations. Thank you.
Okay, that was a powerful presentation, and we are charged with some important questions that we may come back to. As I said, we're going to be discussing small table discussions where we're going to get your voices, and we will do that after the third presentation. So the second presenter is going to be online. It is Bonnie McKay. Bonnie is a professor emeritus from Rutgers University. She has studied fisheries in Norway, Scotland, Mexico, Nova Scotia, but she started on Fogo Island here in Newfoundland back in the 70s. I know I've actually talked to people at Fogo Island who found her to be a remarkable researcher, but also a valued community member. And they fondly remember you, Bonnie, as young Bonnie Collins. So with further, please, our next presenter, Bonnie McKay.
Well, what a thank you for the introduction, and what a pleasure to be here. I cannot, I mean, I'm quite humbled by having to follow Barb Neese and the, the messages that she has are very, very powerful and really important. And I think we all need to discuss them after these talks. My talk is going to be a little bit, perhaps repeating an awful lot of what you all know and say, and perhaps it's going to be a little bit more prescriptive than what Barb is talking about. It's kind of, and it's more of in the middle level of how do people in their various kinds of associations and relations with each other, their organizations, how do they manage to keep those organizations going, to keep themselves going, to deal with these huge problems that they and challenges that they face. So the three small scale fisheries that I studied most intensively in Newfoundland, in New Jersey in the United States, and in Pacific Mexico, and all happen to be organized with cooperatives, relatively successful cooperatives at that. And I'm going to use these 15 minutes as an opportunity to reflect on what there is about these cooperatives that helps us understand what may be involved in getting governance right. And as I'm sure you've all agreed by now, small scale is indeed a matter of scale, relative scale. Here, the lobster and abalone fishers of Baja California in Pacific Mexico dive and they work their lobster traps from small, open, outboard powered boats. And they're often referred to as artisanal. However, the boats, next slide, please. The boats of the Newfoundland inshore fisheries I've studied, those of Fogo Island on the northeast coast, range from homemade 18, 20-foot outboard engine-powered skiffs used for hand lining to very costly and sophisticated 65-foot craft equipped with seines, gill nets, and otter trawls. Then those are the New Jersey ports, and next slide, please, of Bedford and Point Pleasant Beach that I've studied. They're pretty large otter trawl vessels by and large, some others as well. And anyway, all of these, in these three cases, these three places, they're all more or less integrated into national and global markets. And they're all ensconced within regional and national fisheries management systems and rules and regulations and so forth. Next slide, please. I'll just keep this slide for a while. Okay, important are their engagements with aspects of community. And I think that's where they link mostly more than any other way with the general class of fisheries we call small scale. And the Fogo Island Fisheries Cooperative was created in 1967 as a key part of an effort to, quote, redevelop, unquote, an island community that might otherwise have been forced to resettle elsewhere at a time when resettlement was seen as rather tragically seen as a solution to Newfoundland's problems. And from the outset, this cooperative has had major community goals and functions. The Mexican cooperative in Baja California was initially established in the 1930s in the context of the Mexican Revolution, are networked into a federation for marketing and government relations purposes, but each is fundamentally the mainstay of a local community and provides many, many clear benefits in not just employment, but also social services to the local communities. And in both instances, fishing has long been the key source of livelihood for people in those communities. Now, the New Jersey Cooperative is quite different. It was created in the early 1950s after World War II, solely for the purposes of improving the market power and dock access for a small group of vessel owners, and has little to do with the local community, which is mainly oriented toward coastal tourism. So there, the relevant community as such is narrowed to the members of the cooperative and others who work with them. It's a business community, although the fishers and their families are part of a loose and dispersed occupational community within the region. Now, co-ops and other worker or producer-owned organizations are not easy to create and maintain in capitalist economies, even though they often have legal protection. It so happens that each of these cooperatives that I have had the fortune to study is remarkable in having lasted for many decades. They're virtually unique in their regions. So how are these fishing cooperatives managing? And how are they engaged in processes and institutions of governance? Fundamental governance issue is creating and sustaining a process and organization, such as a cooperative, to serve its members, a goal relevant more broadly in small-scale fisheries, where people are trying to organize themselves to assure better conditions. So some of the general principles for cooperatives that I'm going to discuss may be useful to this broader question of getting governance right for small-scale fisheries. Next slide. Most cooperatives are based on principles that derive from the so-called Rochdale pioneers, people who created a cooperative in Rochdale, England, back in 1844. And over the years, the general principles of cooperatives have evolved from this, and they're accepted internationally. Here's a list of them that on this slide. The membership be voluntary and open, that democracy prevails in policy making, decision making, that the benefits come from what people contribute to the business, not from the capital invested, that they be autonomous and more or less independent, that they recognize and provide for the members education, training, and information, that there be networking among the cooperatives, that they are concerned for the sustainable development of their communities. And I added to their list that they have trustworthy and capable leadership. So I'm not going to go through all these in any great detail, but let me just say, for example, that voluntary and open membership, number one, poses real challenges to cooperatives. They are businesses, and they have the needs of businesses to get very, very good productivity from the members. The Fogo Island Cooperative began in 1967 as a totally inclusive organization to which anyone could belong. School teachers and others obtained shares in the co-op. I could have done so when I arrived in the early 70s. Eventually, membership has narrowed to those more directly engaged in the fisheries, but notably has always included both those who own and work on the boats and those who work in the processing plant and other parts of the cooperative's business. This has created a setting for conflict as well as the need for consensus over matters such as the rights of fishers' family members to jobs in the processing plant. And such conflict has intensified as the union became involved with this cooperative. The issue of voluntary membership is also problematic in that many fishing operations on the island have left the cooperative or never joined, eventually weakening the ability of the cooperative to serve the larger community. For the Fogo Island Cooperative, therefore, the problem is not enough vessel members, given competition from private fishery firms in the region. And this hurts the people who work in the processing plants because there's not enough shellfish coming in to create the kinds of jobs that they want. For other cooperatives, the situation is the opposite. Too many members. In the New Jersey and the Baja California cases, membership is tightly controlled, protecting the interests of existing shareholder members and arguably reducing the transaction costs of decision-making. Boats wishing to join the New Jersey co-op can land their catch at the dock for some period of time, during which they're watched for signs that they can be trusted to follow the co-op's policies and practices, and ideally prove themselves as highly productive fishers. In the Baja California co-ops we studied, potential spam is calling. In the Baja California co-ops we studied, membership is open to everyone in the local community, but would-be members must go through a lengthy apprenticeship, years of apprenticeship, the net effect of which is to keep membership numbers stable, which is critical to the success of their management of the spiny lobster fishery. Now, the really important factor in these co-ops is the democratic control of policy and decision-making by members. Cooperatives are supposed to be highly democratic and egalitarian while allowing for and rewarding superior performance, which is needed for the success of business and hence the whole. So in the co-ops, I've come to know rewards like shares of the profits are distributed according to some measure of performance, but decisions are made on the basis of one member, one vote. There's a tenuous balance involved in ensuring fairness and equity. This is the reason that cooperatives often have short lifespans. Truly participatory and very democratic practice makes a huge difference, however, to the cases studied. And in the extreme, one of the Baja California cooperatives requires that virtually all matters, including fishing rules, be voted upon by the members, and furthermore, that all members must be at the meetings unless excused by doctors, notes from the doctor, etc. Term limits of elected officials also helps reduce conditions for allegations of favoritism and other inequities. So we can go through the other aspects of these cooperatives, autonomy and independence of the cooperative, because they're coming from principle of self-help and so forth. Well known, however, to be critical to the effectiveness of co-ops and indeed all community-based organizations, as we would all agree, is good leadership. Leadership in inspiring and educating members and negotiating with other organizations and government, and basically running the organization in ways that inspire trust and confidence among members and outsiders. Some co-ops like Fogo Island and New Jersey cases rely on a hired manager. The Baja California co-op does not, and insists on having their members as managers and the members holding all offices in the organization. The boards the elected boards are extremely important to the management of the co-ops. And again, I'll refer to the Baja California co-op because it's quite remarkable in that they require that each member of the co-op, full member of the co-op, accepts a leadership position at some point, as well as serves in a policing capacity, which helps to ensure widespread understanding of the co-op and its challenges, and also promotes a more accountable leadership. Trustworthiness is enhanced by the fact that all roles are held only by elected members, and also the serious application of term limits, again, which more widely engage members of leadership and, much to the point in Mexico, reduces the likelihood of corruption. It's not much of a stretch to see these criteria as relevant to other groups engaged in fisheries governance, more broadly construed. Governance is fundamentally a social and political process of organizing, constraining, motivating behavior to achieve various goals. It's an old story, really. The cooperative experiments underscore the importance, we already know, of highly democratic and transparent decision-making, so that the members are truly engaged and the system is perceived as legitimate, increasing the likelihood that members will comply with decisions that are made. In the Newfoundland, Baja California, New Jersey cases, I know these decisions have been not easy to, these have not easy to come up with, because there are real costs to them, immediate economic consequences, for example, on how much fish or shellfish can be brought in, or closures of particular fisheries. Now, the democratic and egalitarian principles also feed into the need for shared and widely distributed knowledge and experience. And I've already suggested that, in that, like, getting people fully engaged in it really helps them to become quite knowledgeable and able to step up to the plate when needed. But every co-op does struggle with the educational challenges, because members are busy just trying to catch and market fish. Participation then in decision-making and being elected or drafted to serve on boards helps members become more knowledgeable and competent. Now, if I went through all this, it would be, you might want to say, wait a minute, haven't we already heard this before? I could have said much the same if I had taken the Eleanor Ostrom perspective. Next slide, please. On governance of the commons at the small scale. Indeed, in our study of the Baja California cooperatives, we found the design principles very useful in explaining the success of these cooperatives. And to some extent, these conclusions, pertinent to the other co-ops as well, resonate with the Rochdale principles of cooperatives. Thus, for instance, smallness of numbers and spatial scale helps a lot, but so does leadership that's accountable to the members and an organization that strives for fairness. High levels of internal and external vigilance were particularly notable in the Mexican case, which involves territorial concessions for extremely valuable abalone and lobster. But as important were the co-op's investments in knowledge about the natural environment. But there it helped that the major products, abalone and lobster, are benthic and not very mobile. Far more easily, next slide, please. Far more easily seen and understood than Newfoundland's Atlantic cod and the similarly migratory species harvested by the New Jersey boats. Newfoundlanders and Jersey boys have to rely more on science, although they too have specialized experience-based and traditional knowledge and are very actively engaged with scientists in fisheries management debates. Isolation and dependency are factors shared by the Fogo Island fishers and the Mexican fishers, as is the greater embeddedness of the fisheries and the cooperatives within the larger community. But overall, they share the same importance of Rochdale's transparent and democratic decision-making, knowledge, leadership, and community mindedness. Next slide. My last slide from the Baja California, oh yeah, I'm sorry. Next slide beyond this. To be more specific, my last slide shifts us from the patently sociological approach reflected in those principles and Ostrom's design principles. And it serves here, for me anyway, in closing, as a reminder that we need to be, as scholars, specific about who, where, when, and what. We need to know context, culture, and history. The creation of each of these cooperatives themselves and the innovations within them, the ways that they have adapted to and somehow managed to come out after huge assaults, including the fisheries moratorium that Barb talked about in Newfoundland, and extraordinary environmental events in Mexico. They have evolved co-management arrangements with scientists, NGOs, and government agencies that have made a big difference. But there have been very specific events that reflect very particular experiences with environmental and political changes. The forms that they take and how they evolve depends heavily also on cultural expectations and histories. The creators of New Jersey's cooperatives, for example, came from areas of Scandinavia with very strong emphasis on voluntary associations and cooperation. The Newfoundlanders are familiar with, although sometimes pessimistic about, cooperative-like arrangements through their history, including the Coker movement of the early 1900s. And then the Mexican Revolution of the 1930s is a major backstory to the remarkable reliance of people in Mexico on cooperative forms of organization. As important, especially to the ability of co-ops and other groups to take bold and risky moves, as have each of these co-ops, is the timing of adaptive challenges and windows of opportunity in relationship to where people and these groups are in relation to their available resources, their internal resources and their external ones, their savings and their help that they might get from governments or NGOs or others. In the Mexican case, other similar groups to the co-ops failed because they were not equipped with resources when particular major environmental shocks occurred. It was a matter of bad luck, of timing, but it was also reflective of their longer-term business and political acumen. So in summary, getting governance right is helped by following certain principles and ensuring that others do the same, but also by being ready when fish stocks collapse or government rules change or whatever, to find fair and equitable ways to adapt. And this may mean being fortunate at that moment to have the money, time, knowledge, bravery, and creativity needed. A successful cooperative invests in accumulating those resources and the political capital that helps get help from other co-ops, from NGOs, from government. None of this is easy, given the demands and needs of the members, especially in hard times. But then democratic governance is never easy. Next slide. Thank you very much. This shows a fishing boat that's going to get fresh water for the co-op fish plant and for the community in Isla de Cedros, Baja California.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Madeline Hall-Arber. Madeline is a professor emeritus from MIT, and we're going to have a different perspective from her because for the last 30 plus years, she's worked with councils, the Northeast, within the New England fisheries. Let's see, which ones did she work with? She's been an advisor on boards, including the New England Fisheries Management Council, Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and the California Ocean Protection Council, among others. She's also a really nice potter. So if you look for her, she has a lovely Facebook page with all her pottery. So she's a multi-talented woman. All right.
Thank you, and thanks for the organizers. This has been a fascinating conference so far. I didn't expect to learn as much as I have since I've been in the business for a while. I don't count the years, Susan, but anyway. Let's see. All right, so my talk is a little bit different from the other two. But I think it has a common thread. I think finding an equitable solution to governance has stretched out for the 2.5 days or the day and a half or 2 days that we've been here or whatever. And so that's what I'm going to be looking at. But the difference is that even though we are talking about small scale fisheries, I think we have some lessons we can learn from large scale fisheries, and the large scale fisheries can learn from the small scale. So this is going to focus particularly on the situation of single vessel owners in the sea scallop fleet in New Bedford that is made up of large boats, large fleets. There are some owners that own 27 boats, but the contrast are the people that own one boat. So when I was first asked to participate, I was looking at what do I know about small scale fisheries? And New England does have some small scale fisheries. It has lobster boats and has clam diggers and so on, but I don't really know enough about them to really talk at any length. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll go back to my fieldwork from when I was getting my PhD but that's quite a few years ago. So those are the pirogues in Senegal. So I ended up in New Bedford, which I do know a lot better now. So the organizers listed the steps that we find are really good, hopefully lead to good governance. And part of that is collaboration, and that's collaboration among the community, among the government agencies and the academics, in addition, of course, to the industry itself. Knowledge acquisition and sharing is really important, inclusion, but most important for our purposes probably is our values, and they're both legal and regional, but they focus on fairness and equitable economic opportunity. So a number of people have talked about small scale fisheries and some of the problems that small scale fisheries face. Things like data deficiency, a lack of research, and political marginalization, and a lingering low status stigma. But what's interesting for me anyway, is that this is true also for the single vessel owners in these context of these large fleets. What's expected of most vessel owners, especially in the scallop fleet, but also in groundfish and others, you want efficiency. You certainly have self-interest, and really your goal is to make money. Fairness and equity are undervalued. That was noticed by Lynn Pinkerton years ago in talking about small scale fisheries, but it's also true, as I said, for these single vessel owners. So New Bedford has a lot of capital flowing through it. For 20 years or more, it's been the top valued port in the US. And that, as I point out, is $451 million for 116 million pounds of seafood in 2019. 84% of that, could be more by now because the groundfish has had its own problems. But anyway, most of that value comes from scallops. So as I said, there are millions of dollars flowing through the city. Now, this flow supports an enormous number of businesses, shoreside, as well as, of course, the boats themselves and the processing plants. But they're the marketers, and they're just lots of people that are involved. So what makes this a decent case study, despite all this money, being in contrast to some of the small scale things we were talking about, is partly the knowledge acquisition and sharing that has gone on in the scallop industry. Now, in 1990s, NOAA was doing their traditional assessments. They'd go out, they'd take their boat out once or twice a year, they'd scoop up some scallops, count the scallops, measure them, and say, this shows a percentage of what is out there. And so at that point, they were saying there's a severe depletion of the scallop stocks, and we're going to stop scallop fishing. Well, the fishermen said, no, that's not the way it is. But they knew that the managers would not pay attention to them. They would not pay attention to fisheries ecological knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous ecological knowledge, any of that, without getting the stamp of approval from the scientists. So luckily in New Bedford, they have the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth that's based in New Bedford. And there have been a few of the scientists there who have actually listened to the fishermen. And so the fishermen talked the head of the program into starting a science project that would analyze how many scallops were actually out there. So the fishermen voluntarily gave their vessels over to the use of these scientists. And this depiction is the pyramid that was built, very innovative at the time, with cameras on it and video cameras as well, still cameras and lights and so on. And they could go in the closed areas because they weren't fishing, they weren't going to collect anything, but they could take pictures of what was out there. And they were able to count the scallops. Kevin Stokesbury is the name of the scientist who ultimately did this. And his students would sit there counting on the pictures how many scallops there were in these particular areas. And they were able to prove that there were a tremendous amount of scallops in those closed areas. And ultimately, actually the NOAA ended up using their techniques for future assessment cruises. So it's made a huge difference. And it's really the collaboration among the fishermen, the scientists, and the managers that led to this multi-million-dollar industry being able to move forward. So scallop regulations are varied. I won't go through the details. I mean, you can read them on the slide, but it's typical days at sea, quotas, so on. But I will make the point that they are not ITQs. And does anybody not know what ITQs are? Okay, maybe I should have asked that in reverse because I don't want to embarrass anybody. But anyway, it is important to know that they aren't ITQs. They are quotas, however. So we know that fisheries management regulations often lead to concentration, consolidation of ownership and of capital. So the worst case in our region is groundfish. They put into place something they called catch shares. In fact, in truth, it's ITQs by another name, and it devastated the groundfish industry. Thriving ports now have a handful of boats and very little stock coming in. So there has been a debate ever since the regulations were put in place on scallops about whether or not they should really have ITQs. Luckily, when the first social impact assessment was done, Julia Olson, fantastic social scientist, did a very complete research review and cataloged the likely impacts of ITQs on the scallop industry and the community. And they decided not to put them in place. However, it's been a few years since then. And now, again, there are people asking for ITQs. Now, these are mostly the fleet owners. One of the fleet owners owns 27 boats. And each boat has a permit with a certain amount of quota associated. And he would like to be able to stack those permits so that he only has to use maybe half of his number of boats that he has and go out fishing. Now, at the bottom here, I say fisheries are not alone. There was a really nice little article by Heather Cox Richardson, who's a historian, talking about corporations and the change in how they are so consolidated now, and how that has really been very difficult for us in the pandemic. And it's kind of a little off topic, but anyway, it's just understand that it's not just fisheries that are undergoing these issues. So we have now these two approaches. One is a preference for permit stacking or leasing, and that will lead undoubtedly to, I mean, even the owners of these fleets have said it will allow them to consolidate all of their permits on one or two boats, or half the boats, 10 boats maybe. It'll be more efficient. Then there are the other people who say, no, we need diversity. We need individual vessel ownership and permit ownerships. So this is going to come up for discussion in September. They've already had scoping sessions. The council will take this up again. And the proposal is, of course, to allow the leasing of quota and days at sea. And some scallop vessel owners argue that, they can't efficiently use their boats efficiently without this. But we know from the research that's been done that there are many downsides to leasing and to ITQs. You likely to increase fishing access and revenue within this concentrated group of large fleet owners. It increases their buying power and it's likely to increase their vertical integration. It also tends to obstruct access to shoreside services by the small boat owners or the single vessel owners. There's also likely to be diminishing crew income, ecological impacts, and community impacts. So there's a question, is this necessity or is it greed? I'm sure there's some nuances there, but that's really the bottom line. So it is true that there is an underutilization of the fleet, but that was purposeful. The managers put that in place to keep the pressure off the stocks to some extent. There are indications that it's not really a problem either, because since 1994, the fleet has been pretty stable in terms of its size, the number of boats, and almost half the fleet was built after 1996, which kind of indicates that the people buying the boats think it's a good investment. That also is confirmed by several major international investors coming in. Now, New Bedford has been known as a hub port, and that's a place where people, no matter what fishery they're in, can come to and get the services they need. And what's nice about it is it's not just one business providing the service to each, it's not one that provides the services that are needed, but multiple businesses. There's also a lot of women working in the industry. Now, they aren't always acknowledged or recognized, but that's beginning to change a little bit. I list just some of the activities that they're known for, and gear mending, trip preparation, accounting. In fact, in New Bedford, accounting is interesting because they have what they call settlement houses that pay the bills, they divide the shares, and they make out the checks for the crew and so on. And they're all women. The settlement houses were all owned and operated by women. Fish processing, we've already talked about several times over the last couple of days. There are a lot of women involved. Trading and marketing, they're involved. Healthcare outreach, that's something we haven't really touched on, but that is an important role for a lot of there are several organizations that are focused on healthcare for the fishing industry. And activism, that's been an important role in the Northeast for women for years, as long as I've been looking at it anyway. So I mentioned some of the negative impacts of consolidation. These are some of the negative impacts on individual vessel owners. They are likely to have less access to capital. So it'll be hard for them to lease additional quota. And they have disadvantages in hiring crew and accessing shoreside services. I think I mentioned that before. Prices for insurance and other services, and even lower prices for their products. I mean, they could bring in the same bunch of scallops and get lower prices. There are also negative impacts on the community itself. We've mentioned several times the graying of the fleet. Well, it used to be that a crew member could plan to work, start as a young man and plan to work his way up and eventually be able to buy a boat and a permit. You can't do that anymore. It's way too much money. They would never be able to. Am I all out of time? Almost. Okay, sorry. I better hurry up. So we also are concerned about the loss of jobs for women, reduction of competition and consolidation. The ecological impacts they tend to increase efficiency tends to increase the sizes of the catch. And that's particularly for the large vessel owners. That naturally has negative ecological effects. The managers say, we have to control this. So they put in more complex and longer regulations, more strict regulations. But these apply to everybody. It's not just to the large fleet owners that are catching more fish, it's to everybody. So everybody suffers. So it's really a debate between values, and lacking time, I won't go through all of these. I mentioned some of them already. The bottom line for me is the cultural values part that gets screwed up. So for me, fisheries governance done right leads to resilience. And that's what we'd like to see, whether it's small scale or large scale, or whether it's single vessel owners in that large scale context. So that's it.
Thank you. And as this morning, I realized we are missing a voice. And so I just went over and I asked if we could actually have a perspective from fisheries, from the First Nations, the indigenous fisheries. So we should get a microphone over there so that we can get their perspective as well before we break into small groups. And remember, all of these are perspectives. They don't necessarily, they aren't right or wrong. They're challenging you to think. And so that's why I want to add this perspective.
Ani Boju, Nick Indigenous Makwad Odem. I come with kind of a troubled heart right now. And an amazing thing happened this morning. And I got this quote on my cell phone. I never looked at it really deeply. But it says, 4 days before he was killed, Crazy Horse said this to Sitting Bull. Upon suffering beyond suffering, the Red Nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for the sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, separation, a world longing for a light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again. In that day, there will be those among the Lakota who will carry knowledge and understanding of unity among all living things. And the young white ones will come to those of my people, and ask for this wisdom. I salute the light within your eyes where the whole universe dwells. And when you are at the center within you and I am at that place within me shall be one again. So I got thinking about that. What does that mean? I've heard a lot of things over the last couple of days. And I appreciate the time of being asked if we would speak. That really hurt to know that there was nothing on the governance panel from a First Nations perspective. Similar to most government agencies, and I'm not relaying that you are a government agency, but that most government agencies try to put policy in place without consulting the First Nations. Our lands, our territories have been savagely raped of minerals, trees, animals, and even just the love for one another. And I can appreciate your comments too, sir, of how our fleets are aging. I remember in '96 in our community when we won the right through the Jones-Nadjuan decision to be able to fish again. We had 15 tugs in the water and we had probably 18 punts. We're now down to 3 tugs, maybe 2 punts, and our community is losing that knowledge at an astronomical rate because of the marginalization and the lack of money that is there for the fish that we catch. And we don't do it just for the money. We want to continue on those traditions and that culture. But I thought long and hard over this over lunch. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave this conference because there was that lack of respect for First Nations people. And the fact that Indigenous Day wasn't even acknowledged and that we weren't even asked to speak on the governance panel, that's not getting it right. Maybe we can get it right next time. Thank you.
Our staff was to do a presentation at 6 o'clock tonight, and unfortunately, we will not be present. Miigwech.
It's unfortunate because this is the time when we actually wanted everyone's voice to be heard. This is the time when, if you look around, we'd like everyone to get into small groups and to actually talk about what is governance? What is it a process? Is it a framework? We've had some challenges. I don't know if you want to put your questions back up. But we'd like to request of everyone, please think about one. So here's the problem. Governance is really complex. Oh, governance is really complex. But to really convince government, scientists, we need to be able to get through some of that complexity so we can explain it, right? So we can understand what is it what is governance? And I know that there's a lot of different perspectives in this room. I've heard some really fabulous papers on different frameworks and different principles that should be part of governance. The speakers today were invited to not tell us what is right or wrong, but to just stimulate conversation. And that's what we'd like you to do now. So we have newsprint, and we'd like to challenge you for the next half hour to come up with 3 crucial pieces that are principles or framework or something about governance. We'll ask you to come up and present your top idea. And if it's already been presented, you go to your second idea. And so that's what we're going to do for the next half hour. So if you're sitting at a table with just a couple of people, would you please move to it? We'd like to have at least 10 people per table. And
Sorry, can I just say something quickly before we go there? I think that's great to have conversation. Hi, everybody. Okay, so if you, yeah, I have been doing this around the world. Yes, this is not the first time we're organizing conference, and it's always interesting because we are, in a space where a lot of people have different ideas and may have different expectations, and perhaps it is partly my fault that I never really made it clear in terms of what this conference is about. And I guess a lot of us who have decided to be part of the conference, do so in a way that either you're familiar with it because this is something that you've been doing, or you come in with good faith thinking that, well, I might be hearing something that I haven't heard before. I might meet people who I always wanted to interact with and never had time to do. We have always been very direct about the principles that we operate, which is to provide space that we believe that is diverse and inclusive. And every one of the organizing committees, of course, have done their work, working really hard to say what would be the good way to provide that space. So remember that it's just like every conference, it's an open call. So we let everybody make your own decision about whether you want to participate. And once you do that, we basically said, okay, of all of those who are interested in being part of these, can we put sessions for us so that we are able to exchange information, sharing knowledge, and then think about working towards some kind of, a togetherness, some kind of collaboration, networking, and really moving forward together. So I think for all of you who have decided to be part of this, I hope you are still feeling that this is a good space for you to do that. Of course, there could have been more opportunities to really have more one-on-one or even, direct conversation about this. And I think we have provided that opportunity for people to speak, to share, to really express your feeling and your concern. And, there's never enough time. But like this morning, we also try to get people to say something, to talk about how you feel and what you want to see next. And I think all of you here who are still here, you are very patient. But that's what we all have to be, because nothing is ever going to go as whatever we want, we like to see. But this is how the world is. And we are doing our best and we're doing our bit. And I still would like to really thank, especially the organizers of this session. You have done your work and put a really good panel together for us. So can I have another round of applause for our organizers, especially of this session, and also our speakers, because those are so important, the messages. And I'm glad people heard it. And whatever people want to take out of this, it's really entirely up to us. So we all have our hats, we all have our concern, our issues. We did make very good effort. It was acknowledged this morning. Today is National Indigenous Peoples Day. It was mentioned many times. Kristen, who is part of the organizers of this session, talked to us about a movie that is really going to be speaking a lot to that respect and effort to trying to acknowledge peoples and their knowledge and their culture and their values. So I still would like to encourage us to try to go to a film session that is happening at 8:30 tonight on campus. The bus is leaving, I have to say, right? The bus is leaving at 7:30 and there'll be pizza before that. Okay, now Susan, you still like people to try to get together and do something?
I don't know. Would people like to get together and chat in small groups or just ask questions of at this point, we have about half an hour left. We were hoping to have more time. Yes.
Maybe it's like changing the plan, just keep everyone here and then. Because we don't have a lot.
Sorry, you need to speak to Prateep. Prateep is part of the organizer of this session, so take the microphone.
Maybe a change in plan and keep everyone here and then just interact similar to the other plenaries, because we don't have a lot of time to break out. And
No, that's right. Yeah. Do we have questions?
I have some questions from the virtual participants. I think the question will be for Madeline. Sorry, so the question is, responding to kind of some of the governance gaps that are missing. And then continue to say it's been a fascinating discussion. And the question I think for Madeline is single vessel ownership key for small scale fisheries? Small scale fisheries.
Well,
I don't think necessarily I think a lot of the small scale fisheries that have done well have been single operator owner and sort of boots on deck, they call it. And that's one way to approach it. But in the case of New Bedford, I wouldn't call the single vessel owner necessarily a small scale, part of a small scale fishery, because the scallop fishery is by no means small scale, but there are aspects that I think are important to pay attention to. And that's what I was trying to address, that there are aspects that are very similar to what the small scale fisheries face. And that sometimes these single vessel owners are not listened to because they only have one vessel. They don't have the power. It's that power question again. Maybe that's the real issue. So I don't know, hope that answers the question.
Hello there. Yeah, again, Kevin Scribner from the Pacific Northwest. And I have an actual invitation and then a question. The invitation is to you, Bonnie, to join Peter Halme and I, who between us probably have 100 years of beating our head against the seawall of self-good governance in the fishing world. But we're very keenly interested in co-ops, and we'll be talking about that. It's the session 4.2 in Salon C. So if you could join us tonight, you know, what you said is very resonant with what the questions we'll be asking folks to help us with. So that's an invitation, Bonnie. So thank you very much on that. The question is about having to do good governance with folks from representatives and staff from government. And because there's one thing that happens when you're in a room without government, but when you're in a room with government and trying to do good governance. And I have over the years developed a real good antenna for fear and for scarcity, a sense of scarcity, because I think those are very, very difficult attitudes to be able to come forward with creative solutions. So the question is you, from your research and your experience, do you have a sense of what is the source of fear if a state or a federal agency staff comes, you know, exhibited fear? Do they have a fear of losing a job, fear of going outside their lanes in terms of the rules and regulations? And I can understand why they may bring in a sense of scarcity because they are coming from a regulatory world and it's defined by rules. But is that an okay question to ask about why there may be a sense of fear from agency people?
I think it's a good question. I think you're absolutely right. There's often a sense of fear. I'm not a government, I never was part of the government agency. I dealt with a lot of the government folks, and they are under a lot of pressure to perform the way their agency wants them to, and to abide by the rules that are set by the agency, not to embarrass the agency. And so I think that's part of it, but part of it's also that they know in a group like you're talking about, that they're talking about people who are out on the water, know what they're doing, but it's kind of this mixed message that the scientists and the government agency people get, because they're told that only science really knows the answers, not these fishermen. And so it's just kind of, they have to listen, but they don't really want to, kind of thing, or they don't, I don't know. I'm going to get myself, put my foot in my mouth too much, but yeah, I think that it can be a problem.
And I want to make sure to say not every staffer projects that. It's not every ubiquitous, but it happens at times.
Right. I think it's actually getting better over the years that I was doing active research and working with different government groups. I think people became more knowledgeable and more aware. And as social science became more accepted, I think that people realized that there were other aspects that were important, not just counting fish.
Who else? Yes, go ahead.
You know, I asked the question whether you had 100 years experience total or 100 years each, and I didn't know quite know. Because 100 years total, that ain't nothing. To answer your question, Madeline, I have found over years that we're talking two different languages. The scientists are talking this language, and they're talking stock assessment and talking random transect, and the fishermen, that makes no sense. There's no fish over there, they're over there. You're counting in the wrong place. But after talking, having beers for 10, 15 years, you start speaking the same language. And all of a sudden you get things done after that. So the first 15 years is all bullshit. After that, you get good work.
Well, all right, way over here.
Hello, my name is Nathan Stanley. I was invited to the conference to give a legal perspective on small-scale fisheries, and we'll be discussing that later in one of the parallel sessions. But my question for the panel today is sort of for all of you. So when we discussed fisheries, of course, a lot of the things we've heard over the last 2 days have been about science, that sort of thing. I think a lot of us are very interested in the governance panel today, which has had a lot of discussions about culture and society and the human impact and that sort of thing as well. So when it comes to regulations and laws and the ways we actually govern the fisheries, in what ways, like if you have any clear examples that you can think of, I'd like if you could give some, where fisheries regulation has actually either really helped or kind of really harmed the human or society or culture side of the fisheries, and how in your perspective, quote, legislation or legal approaches to fisheries be made a little better, I guess, to sort of help the cultural or human side of things as well.
Harvey, you wanna? I don't, it's not active yet. I don't. Is it on? Yeah, okay, thanks, Nathan. I just want to go back to this conversation over here for a minute. Maybe it feels safer, I don't know. But there was a big project that I was just part of, and Rob Stevenson was one of the leaders on it, that was about science industry research collaborations. And it was I think it was kicked off by people who are involved in these collaborations, particularly on the industry side, a lot of them, but not all of them, who kept running up against the same problems or felt that they were there. And it was a really interesting exercise, because essentially what it did was it said, well, what are the sort of things that seem to be the main barrier to these, that we need all the best knowledge that we can get. There are huge potential opportunities here that we just don't pursue, we don't develop. And so where are the barriers? And they took basically they identified in consultations in multiple continents, what are the sort of main barriers or problems. And then what they did was they looked at the literature and they said, okay, is this a real problem or is it not? Does being involvement with industry inevitably, taint the results of the research? Does it, and so on. And so, I mean, Rob can speak to this better than me. But the point is that it quite clearly there are these persistent, and I think new people coming in all the time, and you get this turnover, bring the same kind of latent assumptions and fears about science and how science works, and they're inevitable this and the inevitable that. And so it's really clear from the work, I think, is that what you really need to do is, figure out how to handle these potential issues, right? You have to put in place a kind of learning institutional structure that will help to make that problem that, that exists to some degree, but it's resolvable and it's not unique to science industry research collaborations. And these are some of the findings. So that's under review now, but I think it was a really important exercise. And I think it speaks to some of the issues that are being raised there. In terms of, I guess, what I would say, Nathan, is, I've obviously talked about the cod collapse, good place to start. But, the part of what the kind of learning process for me of interacting with fish harvesters, right, was we asked them about all the species they fish. We didn't just ask them about cod. Right, and so we learned about the dynamics of the fishery and what happened basically as stocks were overfished and as certain types of changes were happening. And that was a real kind of important thing for me. And the other thing is it made the complex assemblage ecology of the bays where most of them fished, because they were mostly small scale, it made it visible. And I think so. If we move to a smaller scale kind of hurt, if you like, in the policy process, it's the failure to
to investigate, those complex assemblages are there. We know these patterns are there, but we don't invest the resources to actually understand what's happening, right? There's no consistent follow through. And then the consequences are, I think, the inability in some sense to pursue a fishery that you could pursue, or the inability of small scale fishers that would take of the flounder study that we're working on right now, to be, if this study doesn't happen, the inability, because there's no data, to lay claim to a resource that historically we now know is extremely important to their incomes, and we also know is not being measured effectively by research vessel surveys, right? So there's some missed opportunities, and those missed opportunities are huge, right? That extra fishery, that extra opportunity makes it easier for them to survive, in a sense, and to not put pressure and to not have to push back and say we have to keep fishing even when they're ambivalent and concerned themselves about the resource. So I mean, I think that it's foregone opportunities and also extra costs, extra pressures. Another perfect example for me as a health and safety researcher was what happened after the cod collapse. And for good reasons, small harvesters were given permits to go fish crab. But the point is, nobody dealt with the health and safety risks that came with taking vessels designed for fishing by the coast and experience and knowledge there and moving those boats out into deep water across shipping lanes and so on. And the statistics are clear, a massive spike in search and rescue incidents and serious problems that didn't need to happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have part statement and part question. I'm going to make good use of the expertise and leadership on the panel. So I'm going to come back to a little bit about what happened earlier. This was in many ways part of my interactions with the people that left. So I know that there was some concerns about how they were represented in the great plenaries with these wonderful speakers. And I approached them at lunch, trying to encourage collaboration, trying to position the great speakers that we have as catalysts to a broader and more integrative discussion. I made a mistake in my interaction, which was to start talking about what we were doing right, instead of starting to ask what we could do better. And so as a result, they had a very critical, thoughtful, I heard, discussion over lunch and decided to leave. So I hope that we can have good conversations about getting our interactions right as part of getting governance right, so that people feel included. So if you would like to talk about what happened, we should do that. To bring this a little bit to our panel with three people that I have a lot of respect for. As I'm trying to build fisheries networks that include many different types of people, how do I lead while getting those interactions right? So how do I do governance right myself? It's a big question, but I hope the panelists and everybody around here can help me do better. Thank you.
I'm going to take a first go at this. I think you already identified what is best is to listen first. So to ask how people want to be represented, ask people what would work for them. I mean, that's been the fishermen's issues for many years, is that people never asked, or if they did ask, they didn't listen. So I think asking first and then acting on that information is exactly what you need to do. And you already identified it yourself. So, and it's hard when you, in the middle of something like this, where you suddenly realize, oh my God, I didn't do this right.
Yeah.
So it's hard to make up for it. And some people, if you look at the history too of relationships with the indigenous groups, and I'm in the Northeast, we only really have one major indigenous tribe, and they haven't been very involved in fisheries. So I've spoken to them some, but not at great length. So I can't answer at great length. But from some of the other organizations that I've been involved with, I have learned that there is a very high sensitivity now. People realize what's been done to them really over the years. So there's a lot of work to make up for that. And so I can understand it, but I sympathize with your position as well.
Thanks. Bonnie, would you like to comment? Having worked in a number of different cultures.
Well, I mean, there's not much more to add. Obviously, it is. I mean, I think the organizers of this plenary and had done their job, taking the topic as, thinking about the topic and framing the topic in the way that they did. It could have been different if it had been organized around a different version of the topic. The question of who should be engaged in governance sort of question, and how do we get marginalized groups more centrally engaged. I mean, it could have been done that way, but for good for reasons it was not. I just don't know the local politics. I wouldn't want to say anything more about it. These meetings, maybe the word Congress is a little bit misleading. If it was a conference, is more, I think, captures much more of the academic flavor of this. And a Congress suggests that there really are going to be some important decisions that are made, or some kind of an agreement will come out of it, and so forth, in which case you really do have to be very, very close attention, and you would, to who is at the table and who is speaking. I don't know. I haven't been at the conference, and I really wish I were there, because I'd love to see all of you. I don't know who's there representing, or from the small scale fisheries of Newfoundland and Labrador, and Nova Scotia in the region, who could easily be there, and what roles they have. But I would imagine they are there, and I would want to listen to them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Why don't you go next?
Excuse me, Kevin again. One suggestion in looking at the title of the presentation they were going to present tonight, Two-Eyed Seeing, is American Fisheries Society, the Northwest chapters, 2 years in 2021, had a plenary that was on Two-Eyed Seeing. And it was about, so that was right at the beginning of the entire event. It was to embrace that plurality of it was looking at a plurality of indigenous science and learning and Western science. So there's a way to kind of introduce that. And I think Erica did in the morning plenary, talked about local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and science knowledge. So that may be a suggestion next time too.
Hi, thanks, Megan Bailey, Dalhousie University. I just want to say thanks to Evan for, just trying to take responsibility. But I do want to add that there's an organizing committee, which I am a part of, and there are several people in this room that were a part of. So I also think it's our responsibility as a group as well, in a community, right? So I just don't want you, shouldering everything that just happened on your shoulders, Evan. And just to say, There are lots of moments of discomfort in collaborative projects with Indigenous peoples around multiple ways of knowing, integrating knowledge systems. Like if it's easy, you're not doing it right. That's what lots of partners have said in a lot of our interactions, right? So the discomfort is something that will happen, and it will happen over and over again, and we will make mistakes over and over again. We have to learn from them. And I think it's important to talk the things out and feel the feelings and all that. And so I just, again, thanks for kind of coming back to it and giving the space here to talk about it. But yeah, it's okay to be uncomfortable. Like you know, and we all have the luxury, Gerald and I were talking about this yesterday, we all have the luxury of like leaving this room and being comfortable again, right? And that's a privilege that not everyone has. And so actually like sit with this for a little while, longer than you want to, because it's a burden that we don't always have to bear. So I think it's important that we do bear it at times. So thanks, thank you.
Thank you. We're just about out of time. We'll do one more question.
Yes, my name is Chris Milley. I worked 17 years for the Chiefs as the Mi'kmaq Chiefs as the director of the Mi'kmaq Fish and Wildlife Commission. And I've gone through many of these meetings where I was on the other side of the table. I was with them on the outside. Excuse me if I seem a little nervous. I've continued to work with First Nations as consultant and as an adjunct in Marine Affairs program at Dalhousie. And it's not the fault of any organizers. What you're suffering right now is the sense of frustration that First Nations have, that we've changed the way we talk about First Nations, but we haven't changed the way we do business. And I'll give you an example. We're doing a lot of work, and I know DFO is doing a lot of work to advance engagement and interaction with First Nations. At the same time, another part of DFO is taking the chiefs to court over fishing for livelihoods. So one group is saying, we've got a good working relationship. At the same time, that same group is having to hire lawyers to deal with it in court. It's not something that is in this room. It's something that's in society, that we haven't changed the way we do things. And people are getting more and more frustrated. 25 years ago, when the Marshall decision came down, there was a blockade in Yarmouth. And the negotiating withdrawal of the blockade, some very strong working relationships were formed between the inshore fishermen and the Mi'kmaq communities. Those relationships are still very strong today. At the same time, the children of those fishermen are the ones who are protesting and fighting against the new entrants into the fishery. So nothing has changed. We talk, but we don't change the way we do things. And that's something we have to be able to come to terms with. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd just like to close the session by saying that I think we've all learned something. One of the things that I'm really taking away from this is to get governance right, we have to identify the barriers right. And I think we've made a good progress in acknowledging these barriers, because without overcoming them, we'll never get governance right. And I think we did a good job of discussing that today. Thank you. Yeah.
There's always a first of everything, but this is never going to be the last. Remember this word though. I'm going to go back to you, Evan, because you said that we need to get interactions, right? We need to work on interactions. Or interactions, multiple actors having to interact. So I hope you will continue to have good interaction, and let's talk about it. And you know, whatever, comfortable, happy or not, we do it all. And we will continue with our conversation with the concurrent sessions happening this afternoon, movie tonight, and then tomorrow we are staying in this room for the whole day. And that will be a really good space and really good time to get it all out. And then eventually, hopefully we'll get it right. Thank you.